Hello everyone. Get some tea, something that you would like to drink, I don't know, maybe something to eat, because today I'm gonna be sharing all of the books that I read in 2020. I am really excited to be recording / filming this video for you guys because this is something that I've never done before, but I decided to do something different because if you did come from my podcast, the Locals podcast with Allison Weaver, aka me, I have a podcast where I highlight different locals, whether they be here in Southern California where I reside or maybe somewhere different, something different, because as many of you guys know, I've been doing a lot of reading in 2020. I am an English major, so reading is something that I just do whether I like it or whether I don't like it, and 2020 actually allowed me more so to read things that I personally enjoyed. So if you are someone that does not like reading, I understand, because I am the exact same way. Well, I guess segue, I have a learning disability, and I remember when I was really young, I would always have these meetings with a lot of my teachers, school administrators, and obviously my parents. So within those meetings, a lot of the times they were like, if your daughter could just read more, and I was just like, I don't like reading, never have liked reading. I'm not gonna read Judy B. Jones. Just kidding. I did read Judy B. Jones. Quite honest with you guys, I have a lot of catching up to do when it comes to being well equipped in the literary community and space, because I personally don't gravitate towards many of the classics, and I think that's because many of the classics usually showcase very Eurocentric centered protagonist, and as you can see, I don't fall within that category. So many of the books that I'm going to be showing today are written by people of color or people that are in marginalized communities, and they are now authors, which is amazing. So I'm really excited because many of these books really did shape and reshape the person that I am today. So here we go. First things first, we do have to have some tea. I am drinking Enchanting. I believe that's how you pronounce it. I just really love these little quotes that come on it. This is probably really hot, but I'm gonna take a sip. It's so good. Okay, so I'm gonna jump right into it, you guys. I'm going to be sharing my favorite book of 2020, which is The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. This book, girlies, this is a novel that you want to read. This is something that made me feel warm. It made me feel seen, and many of the books I probably will say those same synonyms for, because many of the books that I read, as we know, 2020 was a very transformational year, so I became more in tune with just a lot of different African American literary individuals and just the community of being Black. So I read a lot of books that were based on just the Black experience. However, this book is a little different. I think that this book is something that will stay on the shelves and be completely timeless, to be quite honest. This book showcases two twins, actually. One of the twins continues her life as a white passing individual, and the other continues her life as identifying as a Black woman. So it's really interesting because within the book they live drastically different lives and they marry different people. We kind of get in tune about gender as well. There's a lot about gender in this book. There's a lot about just classism in this book, which is really interesting because, as you can imagine, continuing their life, that I believe one of them lives in the South and another twin actually migrates here in California. It says in the little synopsis here, weaving together multiple strands and generations from the deep south to California. From the 1950s to the 1990s, The Vanishing Half is at once riveting emotional family story and a brilliant exploration on race, gender, and identity, and the lasting influence of the past as it shapes a person's desires and expectations. When I tell you that this is like one of the books that really, while I was reading, I could visualize it. And this is the thing that I'm like talking about. When I was a kid, I did not have a book that really resonated me in this way. And this book does just that. It takes so many things that I experienced as a young girl, and it just weaved it into something that was so poetic and something that was so just heartwarming in many ways. So I could go on and on about this book. Britt Bennett is definitely just a really good writer in the way that she was able to captivate her audience and let people know that, you know, you don't necessarily need to be Black to read this book. If anything, I would highly recommend it. If anyone should read this book, to be quite honest, because it doesn't like, there's more books that I'm going to show in a few seconds that are very like Black history heavy, and you don't get that with this book. You get more so just like a timeline and a storyline of two completely different protagonists and how their lives kind of mesh, but sometimes don't mesh. So I highly recommend this book. It's a book that I will probably revisit. Okay, so I'm not going in any type of particular order. You guys can just sit and kind of enjoy the show of me showing the books that I read. The next book that I read was The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison is a powerhouse author, and I never had actually read anything by Toni Morrison. And someone, you know, as someone that is a English major, I really wanted to kind of dive deep into her works. I remember I read this book actually in the summer. I read it with a friend, my friend Phoebe. We did our own like kind of like book club in a way, and I really enjoyed just how this book was different. It was definitely more of a harder read for me. Honestly, to be quite honest, I just got into reading about this year. I've always read things and books and articles and different memoirs, autobiographies, biographies. You guys know, when you're in school, you're constantly reading. However, this time, for the very first time in my life, I was reading because I wanted to read and not because someone was telling me to read. So this book was something that I was kind of already accustomed to because I do take a lot of English classes. However, the cool thing about Toni Morrison is that she is a Black woman. So this was really awesome to read because I have a very tiny selection of Black women authors that I have read in the course of my study and my degree research of English. I would recommend this book to people that are a little bit more mature, just because there's a lot of verbiage, there's a lot of things that go on that may be a bit triggering when you read this book. It's really heart-wrenching at times because this book really dissects on a lot of things like colorism, and as someone that is of darker complexion, I resonated with the protagonist in many ways, peculiar, because we really get to see how she transforms. It makes me kind of emotional because her character arc is so transformative. Like the way that we see her from just being so pure in adolescence to honestly getting that taken away from her. And that's something that I could talk about just for hours, is how many young Black little girls they are not deemed as being pure and innocent and juvenile, and Toni Morrison depicts that effortlessly in The Bluest Eye. So I would say pick this up as well. However, this is something that I would pick up once you have read something a little bit more intermediate. I know that that may come across kind of bad, but this is something that definitely is of deeper level. Even when I recommended like to read this with my friend Phoebe, I was kind of like, don't know if I should have had her start with that one. I'm going to take a little bit of a switch in the gears, and I'm going to kind of overlap again. So I'm going to kind of talk about some of the faith-related books that I read this year. I am a Christian, so I do like to read a lot of just different works by Christian authors, and that necessarily does not just stop if you aren't a Christian. I am very interested in just learning about different cultures, religions, different faiths, how people live their lives, different social groups. To be quite honest, I am very open-minded, and that's something that I do pride myself in. I can say that full-heartedly. Books that I read this year that was something that was personally, I think, placed in my hands at such a time as this is More Than Enchanting: Breaking Through Barriers to Influence Your World. I read this also with my friend Phoebe during the summer, and this is by Joe Saxton. This is another book that I highly recommend if you are a woman in faith. Read this book. This book was also something that I felt so validated by. I do go to a private Christian college, and much of the conversation when we have chapel in person, when we used to, was we would have many women speakers come in to our chapel services, and many of them would actually identify as a pastor. And I remember sitting in a chapel once and hearing a white male literally say women should not be pastors, and it irked me for many reasons. And Joe Saxton debunks this whole entire theory that I feel is very prevalent in just the Christian faith, is that women really should kind of be submissive and not really have a voice when it comes to the Bible or just theology in general. And she talks about how God used women all of the time in the Bible, but yet for some reason that just like is so like out of picture, out of sight, out of mind when it comes to. I can't recommend this book enough. This is also a book that I recommend if you just are kind of hesitant about Christianity and you're like, well, the Bible is very misogynistic. This book actually really does help, especially with me, because there was a time where I was like, I wonder if, you know, like, let me dabble into this, because many of my friends do not identify themselves as Christians, and I wanted to understand, like, well, what are they thinking, and how can I be a better proponent in understanding their thoughts, but yet equipping myself to know that the Bible very much does stand for women and what they have to say about God's word. So that was a good book. Kind of switching gears a little bit, this book, I would say by far The Vanishing Half is like my top book of 2020, favorite book. In my faith related category, this is my favorite book. The Color of Compromise by Jemar Tisby. So the full title in its full glory is The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism, and then The Color of Compromise. This book I recommend to everyone. It does not stop if you are just black. It does not stop if you are just white or Asian or Indian or however you identify. This book really at least made me feel seen. As someone that goes to a university that affiliates themselves with the Southern Baptist Convention, I learned so much about the Southern Baptist Convention, and I learned so much about different denominations of Christianity. In this book, it amazed me that years, honestly not too long ago, we were dividing our church because we wanted to keep slaves. Like, we were literally, and then we would justify it in the Bible. Like, it was actually insane to me. And learning about different people that identified themselves as Christians, many of them being pastors, and going to a pulpit on Sunday. You know, on Saturday they may have been doing their rounds with the KKK, and then they would preach on Sunday morning, which was just so interesting to me. This book is something that I think should be on everyone's bookshelf. I don't care who you are, I don't care what you identify with. This book really makes you think, and it really helps you conceptualize just your thoughts as a person of faith, and then it helps you understand, okay, wow, there's a lot to Christianity that I didn't know about, but it really helps you just evolve as a person. I wouldn't want to say that it's going to change you. I would just say that it's going to convict you, and it will definitely help you evolve as a person. So I highly recommend this book. Put it on your TBR for 2021. Once you read it, let's go for a cup of coffee and talk about it and dissect it with each other, because this book, there is some tea in it. Okay, so next on my list, this is also in the faith related category, but it could also cover as well as my classics. Also, that is something that I want to get better at. I want to read a lot more classics in 2021. Read some of C.S. Lewis's works. I actually bought his entire classics collection over the summer, because by the time that I graduate, I would hopefully like to have read all of his classics. These two with my friend over the summer as well. We read The Four Loves, and we also read A Grief Observed. Both of these books are really good. They are a little bit, they're very literature heavy, very philosophical, and that's kind of where everything went across my head, to be quite honest with you. My friend is a philosophy major, so she kind of filled in the gaps there. I was able to fill in the gaps in some other way, but when it came to a lot of just like that deeper thinking, that deeper meaning, it really did fly over my head. And if anything, I will say that reading C.S. Lewis will help you with just becoming a better reader, to be quite honest with you. The Four Loves, it literally asks you the question, how does love work in our daily lives? Eros, charity, affection, friendship, and all of it. So it literally dissects it into each chapter, and it basically tells you how to love in those categories. So it was a really good book. It was definitely a harder read for me. Grief Observed was something that I think that was also placed in my hands at such a time as this, because as we know, 2020 was remarkably crazy, and it is written by C.S. Lewis after his wife's tragic death, and this was something that was placed in my hands at such a time because while I was reading this, I was also grieving the loss of a family member. And that's why I am like a firm believer that, at least for me, like, God places books in my life at certain times because he knows that like it's equipping me, and it's in some way like taking me out into a different world. Like, I'm living vicariously through the protagonist or through the author. So this is a good book. I would highly recommend it when you are reading. I would recommend it when you are like kind of grieving the loss of something or someone. A little bit of a shift change just because I believe that the clip was a little too large that I just recorded, so I'm going to kind of run over the books that I was reading in my young adult literature class. So Unwind, this book, this is why like I would recommend this book, highly recommend this book, because it displaces you. It takes you out from your reality, and it's going to input you into a society that you are not ready for, to be quite honest. Like, when you want a good reader's escape, this is your book. And it's by Neil Shurston, or Shusterman, sorry. And the main characters consist of Connor, Risa, and Lev. They are teenagers and they are running for their lives from a government that is amidst the Civil War. And so it's really interesting that I was reading this book, especially at my very conservative Christian university, because it literally is talking about reproductive rights and how this government is wanting to unwind, aka abort, people. And it's just like, it's really interesting. Like, I'll read a little bit of just the synopsis. The chilling resolution: life is inviolable from the moment of conception until age 13. Between the ages of 13 and 18, however, parents can have their child unwound, whereby all the child's organs are transplanted into different recipients. I'm gonna just stop right there. I'm gonna stop right there because this book gets really good really fast. Dread Nation, I'll be completely honest with you, was a book that I did not have the time to read cover to cover, just because this was, I believe, one of the last reads that I had to do for my young adult literature class. It is a pretty thick gal, but it's not too thick, and I could easily see them, I think, I believe this may be in a trilogy. I may be wrong. If anything, I could honestly see this book being also in like a movie-esque, or like maybe Netflix picking it up for a little limited series rendition, because this book literally is also really good, because as you can tell, we're also talking about the Civil War. So Jane, the main character, was born 2 days before the dead began to walk the battlefields of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, derailing the war between the states and changing the nation forever. In this new America, however, the battle for survival is as political as it is personal, and the restless dead, it would seem, are the last of her problems. So this book is also really good. It's very like dystopian vibes, so if you're into that, highly recommend this read for you. One of the books that also really made me smile and made me kind of a little like, I don't know, it just made me feel intrigued. Like, I was really intrigued to read this book. I would not say that this book gives you like a really good overview of like Latinx culture and community. I would just say that this is a very like young adult-esque book, because it really does encapsulate the protagonist and her point of view. And throughout the novel, she is actually trying to learn more about her sudden passing of her sister. And her sister was the child that was well loved by her family. It's very apparent that the sister was the favorite child, and now her parents are left with with the child that is not their favorite and is a little bit more delinquent. You know, she's a little rambunctious, she is free-spirited, and her sister was nothing of that. So this book really does get good. However, this book, it kind of left me like wanting more. So be prepared for that, but I think that this is something that you're going to really enjoy while you read. You're going to learn so much, and I am a sucker for young adult literature, so if you are a sucker for young adult literature, you will really enjoy this book. Okay, another book that I read within my young adult literature class was Sold. This is a very, 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 very good book. I enjoyed every minute of it because human trafficking is something that is very near and dear to my heart. This is something that I want to always be an advocate for, and it encapsulates a 13-year-old, Lakshima. She is a girl who lives with her family in a small village in Nepal. Though she is desperately poor, her life is full of simple pleasures, which I just really enjoyed, because If anything, 2020 taught me to enjoy the simplicity of life. Like playing hopscotch with her best friend from school and having her mother brush her hair by the light of an oil lamp. Patricia McCormick does an amazing job at really understanding Lakshima's life. She does not try to interject her own thoughts and feelings into this situation because Lakshima literally is a real person. And she, kind of in the back of the book, we get a little bit of a glimpse of who Patricia McCormick is. And she literally did travel to India to kind of just get a understanding of the community and an understanding of what human trafficking does look like in India. And she interviewed women of the red light district and girls who had been rescued from a sex trade. So that's all I'm really going to say, because within this book you're really going to understand, like, wow, this is pretty heavy. Just like one of those books that you want to hug, like, because it's very emotional. So that's a really good book to read when you want to feel the feels, I would say. Okay, we're nearing the end. This is another book that I thoroughly enjoyed. The Undocumented Americans by Carla Villavicencio. I am definitely butchering your name and I am very, very sorry. If you want to talk about learning, if you want to talk about growing to be uncomfortable, this is the book that you should read. This book, there was many interesting parts within this book, and one of them being the fact that, for instance, I was completely unaware that many undocumented Americans were basically transported for work to do like a lot of the 9/11 cleanup, and they did not get paid for it. And they simply did not get paid for it because they were undocumented. So if their name was in the system, they kind of risked their lives in ways. We talked about Flint in this book. We talked about how there was a lot that was happening under the Obama administration. As we know, as many of us know, immigration and all of that just did not come about during the Trump era. You would be naive to think that. And she literally talks about just her opinions on the Trump administration, but also convicting those that are Obama ride or dies and being like, yo, this was happening also under this era. And she effortlessly takes stories that are obviously not her own, and she, much like Patricia McCormick in Sold, she really wants to push to the reader that these are their stories. These are not my stories. I will tell you little glimpses of my story, but this is solely from people that honestly do not have a voice in our society. So I really recommend this book if you want to grow uncomfortable and you want to learn more about just undocumented Americans as a whole and how they continue to survive in our society. So those were some of the books that I read in 2020. Of course, there were many other books that I did not show, and that simply is because I may have had them as like a ebook and they are hosted either on my laptop or some other device. I did read quite a few like audiobooks just because I love a good audiobook, and also within a lot of like my literature classes I have a lot of anthologies, and within anthologies personally I do rent out my anthologies. I do not purchase them. However, I am thinking of starting to do that. But what I want to end you guys out with is, if you have any book recommendations for me, please comment them down below. I really want to build a community in the year 2021, and whether that be just me advocating for you, understanding what society you come from. I also want you to know that reading became a hobby for me because I for the first time, was able to read about protagonists and authors that looked like me. And it's sad to say that it almost took me almost like 15 years of my life to reject the thought of reading, because I did not see people within my sphere that looked like me, that were creating and writing books. So I hope that in the new year you all can find a hobby that brings you joy, because reading definitely was a sense of escapism for me within this year that was really hard. I read a lot about dystopian societies, I read a lot about racism, I've read a lot about gender, and just learning how to grow to be uncomfortable. That's the biggest thing that I want you guys to end off with. And I hope that if you enjoyed this, you would give it a thumbs up. You would also comment down below, because I really do like conversation and building relationships. So cheers to you all, and hopefully I'll see you in another video if you liked it. Bye guys. Thank you.